because now we have some outside analysis. We have journalists, academics, as well as policy makers that are here now to discuss what was said earlier and from an outside perspective, looking at Iraq. Our panelists today will focus on three areas. First, the why. Iraq has slipped back into violence that we had not seen since 2008. Why did this happen? Starting really last April with Hawija, the provincial elections, we saw renewed violence that has continued to this day. So a why. Second will be an analysis of the violence. Is this violence the new norm for Iraq, or is it a crisis? Last will be, most important, solutions. So how can we move beyond this current crisis? Will elections, as earlier colleague mentioned, add fuel to the flames? Or will elections offer some hope to move beyond the current issues that are plaguing this country? So we have three excellent panelists today that will bring diversity of views. First, we have Prashant Rao, whose name I think a lot of us know, how we all get our daily, real-time news about what's going on in Baghdad. And in Iraq, he is the AFP Baghdad Bureau Chief and has been in Baghdad since 2009. Next, we have Dr. Charles Tripp, whose name, at least in American universities, is very well known for his book, A History of Iraq, which we all read. At some point in Middle East studies, he is now doing work on resistance and state power. He is a professor at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, one of the best programs in the world at the University of London. So we have a political scientist perspective. And last but not least, Kirk Sowell. Kirk is an Iraq analyst, a political risk analyst. He is the editor and founder of Inside Iraqi Politics. He writes frequently for Foreign Policy, most recently a wonderful article analyzing Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's decision to go into the Anbar protest sites. So we have an analyst, an academic, and a journalist. So without further ado, Prashant, the floor is yours.
Hi. So as Christine said, well, first let me start by thanking AUIS for inviting me. This is a real honor. This is actually my first panel discussion, so when the questions start, please be gentle. I just wanted to tell you a little bit first about AFP, because I know it's not really a news organization that's very widely known. AFP is one of the three biggest news wires, news agencies in the world, along with the Associated Press and Reuters. Basically, if there's a country on earth, we have a reporter there. And in Iraq, we have journalists in every province of the country except the Hook, for a total journalistic staff of about 40 journalists, including photo, video. It's a big news operation. AFP's been in Iraq for decades, and we're going to be here for a very, very long time. And so it's a very important country to this agency for what we do. I'm going to talk just as briefly as I can about what's happened to the security situation in Iraq, especially in the past 12 months, and then a general summation of what is generally agreed, according to the people we talk to, analysts, diplomats, as to the outlines of how to sort of get that security back under control. When we talk about how security is deteriorated, I think it's important to be humble about what we know, because there is at least one actor in this with whom we have no contact, and that's the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. We have contact that they control with their press releases, their statements, their videos, their message board postings. But effectively, we have no insight into how they operate beyond not enormously, we don't have first-person access to them for obvious reasons. But the nature of violence and the level of violence has clearly changed. I got to Iraq on June 1st, 2009. The Iraqi government's numbers for May 2009 said that about 150 people died, which at the time was the lowest number since 2003. And violence was trending in a direction where it was going down. And it largely stayed stable for about 2 to 3 years with spikes, but then it largely stayed at a level that you wouldn't say is manageable, but seemed to indicate that there was progress being made. But in the past 12 months, it's increased quite dramatically. AFP keeps independent numbers of the levels of violence in Iraq. In February, more than 700 people were killed. That's not just according to us, but the UN's assistance mission in Iraq has said that. The Iraqi government's own numbers say that. And so if you compare that to a year ago, that's 2 to 3 times the level of fatalities. If we look at just Baghdad, in just February, there were 57 security incidents that we can confirm. 31 car bombs in 1 month. 28 days, there were 31 car bombs in one city. And it's not just the level of violence that's changed, but the nature and the character of it has changed as well. I think it's important to note that when I first got here in 2009, the real fear was enormous set-piece attacks, huge bombings involving trucks. One of my first assignments here was, unfortunately, some of you will remember, August 25th, 2009, what's still called Black Wednesday, 2 massive truck bombs at the Foreign Ministry and the Finance Ministry. Then we had another set in October, then December, January, and April. And these enormous attacks were largely concentrated in Baghdad against high-profile targets. The nature, though, of that has now changed dramatically. I'll give you just one sort of example from my own experience. On August 25th, 2009, I was with my colleague at the CPIC, which was the American Press Center, where they issued press badges and things like that. And we were standing waiting for our security team to come pick us up. And while we were standing, all of a sudden the air popped. And the blast wall that we were standing next to shook slightly. And you can imagine, when you stand next to a blast wall, to see it shake, the amount of force that requires. The bombing wasn't anywhere near us in a geographical context, but it illustrates how enormous it was. 2 months later, another set of massive bombings happened. At the time, I was visiting a friend. When I came back, the bombing had been in front of the Baghdad Provincial Council. Our office at the time was at the Mansur Milia Hotel. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Baghdad geography, but those two things are right opposite each other. So we had to run through a pretty horrible mixture of sewage, of what you imagine results from a massive bombing in Baghdad. When I got to the office, the false ceiling had fallen through. All of the glass in our bureau had been shattered, and the electricity was cutting off. Now, a similar thing happened in April 2010 when there was a car bomb outside the Iranian embassy. There had just been 2 bombings in Mansour, which I think some of the diplomatic corps here will recall. They affected embassies like the Syrian embassy, the German embassy, in the sort of western part of Baghdad, the diplomatic district. We were standing up, me and my colleagues, waiting for more information, just sort of milling around. And then all of a sudden, all of us were thrown against the wall by the sheer force of a car bomb, even though we were on the 8th floor of a building and a couple hundred meters away. Again, our false ceiling fell through, the glass shattered. It was a pretty, as you can imagine, traumatic experience. But now, the violence in Iraq is very different. It's much more of a relentless stream of smaller car bombs with less explosive impact and resultingly lower individual casualties. For example, last summer, the supermarket that we frequent called Warda had a bomb right outside it. When I went right afterwards, the facade of the supermarket had been destroyed, but if you were to compare it to what happened in 2009 and 2010, I mean, it's by order of magnitude smaller. Suicide bombings have also become more numerous. These are typically blamed on foreign fighters, but there is an argument as well that Iraqi fighters are involved in some level, but of course, it's hard to figure out exactly how much. In terms of how we talk about the general outlines of a deal or a sort of way to fight this, or to get it under control. I think the general consensus from security analysts I talk to, from diplomats, from analysts, is that it's got to be a multi-tiered, holistic approach. When we talk about security measures, of course, this is a security situation. There's security measures that need to be taken, but there's a general consensus that, of course, there needs to be broader political reconciliation, greater economic growth, and general movement of compromise on all sides. Whether or not that happens, of course, with an election coming up, we'll have to see. But at the moment, there are some moves to one extent or another, with the Prime Minister going to Ramadi promising reconstruction funds, things like that. Of course, if you talk to the people he promised reconstruction funds to, I think there is a level of trepidation with regards to whether there will be follow-through, which has been questionable in the past. The US military would often acknowledge when they were in Iraq that to solve the security problem, you couldn't just approach it from a security angle. US commanders were able to dole out $5,000 grants on their own accord because to promote ostensibly economic growth. There was a huge push towards political reconciliation, and that again is what looks like the outlines of what needs to be done to combat security. I would encourage you, if you're interested in the levels of security, we try our best to be open about the levels of violence. You can follow us, and we publish a daily tracking spreadsheet of what's happening in terms of violence all across the country. But it's important to know, of course, that these are more than just numbers. About a month after I first arrived in Baghdad, there was a bombing at a church near Palestine Street in eastern Baghdad. When I got to the church, the priest was obviously distraught, and he spoke about how it was horrible that these people had lost their lives, but he also made the point that the people who didn't lose their lives are also suffering. People whose cars were destroyed, whose may have depended on them for their livelihoods, shops that are regularly targeted, things like that. It's important, I think, to not get caught up in the numbers of it, but also to look at the overall broader impact that this violence is having on Baghdad, but also the rest of the country. So that's my introduction. I hope that
perfect timing. Thank you. And now Dr. Charles Tripp.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Dr. Barham Saleh and also to the American University in Iraq at Sulaimani for inviting me, and also for giving me the chance to actually visit for the first time, although I say to my shame, the Kurdistan region of Iraq. How does one have the presumption to write about Iraqi history with never having visited Kurdistan? So I have a chance to repair that damage thanks to them. What I want to talk about briefly today is looking at as both a historian of Iraq, but also as a political scientist, as Christine said, to think about some of the dynamics underpinning the present challenges, as it was put, to Iraq itself. That will take in violence to some extent, but of course it will also look at the larger political setting. And the place I'd want to start is really in what I call the founding of the dual state in Iraq, a founding which my own country was not exactly guiltless of. What I mean by the dual state is a founding of a public state on the one hand, but a shadow state on the other. The public state, the constitution, the parliamentary institutions, the ministries, the army, the official institutions of the state, the official boundaries, the internal and external boundaries, but behind it, running through it, and sometimes animating it, the shadow state and its understandings. And what I mean by that are the networks of trust, the networks of community, but also the privilege and the patronage that has often been hand in hand with such networks as well. Fluid, depending upon the circles of power, who's in, who's out, and owes much to a network theory of power. And so historically, one could argue that this was something that the British instituted when they founded or helped to found the state of Iraq, because they created both a public state, but it was more convenient for them to have this other organization behind, an organization which got things done, perhaps not acting by the rules of the public constitution. And historically, therefore, the Iraqi state became a vehicle for power, it became a vehicle for privilege, a vehicle for wealth, for those in at the beginning, and also turning it into a mechanism for excluding those seen as untrustworthy. And with each government in Iraq, there have been obviously different lists about who is in, who is out, who is to be trusted or not. Sadly, given the experiences that the Iraqi people have been through over the years, this dual state system has survived in one form or another. And I think in many ways what we were hearing about this morning are to some extent symptoms of the persistence of the dual state. Arguments about a constitution, a parliament, an institution, but then an acknowledgement that power doesn't actually work that way, that power works through other channels in one form or another, and that however much one defines the institutional, the constitutional apparatus of the state, a fear that somehow they don't count for much against the real powers of patronage networks that run behind it. So one of the features of that has been remarked on this morning, but I would argue has certainly been a feature of Iraq over the last 6 or 7 years, is the centralization of power once again. And the centralization often means, in this context, the personalization of power in the Prime Minister's office. And with it goes the notion that whoever's Prime Minister, it engenders certain attitudes to rivals, enemies, but even to allies. If they're not operating on the conditions set by the Prime Minister, then they find it difficult to operate at all. Of course, that's led to accusations of dictatorship leveled against the present Prime Minister of Iraq, but you can understand why that should be the case. A notion that power crystallizes within the Prime Minister's office. Again, attempts by the Parliament or elements in the Parliament to assert their independence from time to time have been really come to nothing much at all, whether it's on the provincial autonomy law and even, of course, the problems that are emerging about the new election law as well. And it also gives rise to another aspect, which is, of course, corruption. Corruption on a massive scale. Corruption which is not an anomaly of the system, not just a part of the system, but many people fear becomes a cement of the system itself. And again, the fear that corruption is linked to power because it is the cement of power in some form or another. And the difficulty of those many in Iraq who are trying to investigate that, whether it's through the Commission on Public Integrity or whether it's by other means, the difficulty of finding that and exposing it to a public gaze. So I'm not trying to blame everything on the Prime Minister's office, but the structures of power are such that by centralizing, you threaten to do damage in all kinds of ways. By centralizing and personalizing and creating, therefore, a network that sustains the shadow state behind, there is a danger. And I want to just pick out 3, I think, dangers, some of which we've heard the symptoms of described very movingly and vividly already. One is the divisive effects on Iraqi society. And as everyone reading Iraqi politics and history over the last 10 years can see, that's taken 2 forms in terms of social division. One has been the communal division between sect or community, between ethnic community. But of course, it's not because the people operating the system are necessarily particularly sectarian, particularly ethnic, particularly prejudiced in one form or another. But if you set up a personalized system of power that depends upon personal trust, of course, the people who are going to be included are the people who are trusted and who may therefore come from their own community, their region, their family, or whatever it happens to be. So the boundaries of trust narrow. And the dangers of that, of course, is it gives a perception to much of the rest of Iraqi society that they're left out of it in some way or another. Left out of it for any number of reasons that they can put forward, whether that's ethnicity, whether it's sect, whether it's region, whether it's ideology. A notion, in other words, that this is a very exclusive form of power. So perceptions by that one part of society, in a sense, is excluding others, has been deeply problematic. And I think in many ways is not the sole cause, but certainly has fed into the upsurge in sectarian communal violence of the last year. And it's certainly helped to strengthen ethnic communal feelings of difference in the Kurdistan region. Disputed boundaries, separate economies, separate foreign policies, the status of security forces. These are all items of division because people don't trust what's happening at the center. But I argue also that isn't the only division in Iraqi society. The other division is something which often strengthens it and is intertwined with it, which is the divisions of class, of attitudes to your community, not simply based upon religion, ethnicity, and so on, but also depended upon class and class resentments. One could argue, in other words, that the notion of a fear that public office is being transformed into private wealth has clearly been fueling certain aspects of resentment in Iraq. We've seen the resentment in various forms and expressed by very different groups in Baghdad, in Basra, Kut, Misan, Mosul, as well as, of course, in the politics of the Kurdish region itself. One's seen it in the demonstrations in Baghdad and elsewhere of 2011, 2013. Demonstrations about public services, about corruption, about freedom, some of which, of course, were violently suppressed. And we've seen it also in the concerns about press freedom and the security of investigative reporting as well. And I think, again, one of the things that's disturbing is that there is little sign that those at the top really rate this problem. Abysmal public services continue, terrible unemployment figures persist, and repressive trade union laws still remain in force. These are not the means of, as it were, healing a class-divided society. So, again, I think, therefore, one has to think about the ways in which what I've talked about, the personalization, the centralization of power, has led to these two sometimes mutually reinforcing aspects of division. But there's a second symptom, or second outcome, which, again, has not showed itself yet, but given the history of Iraq and my familiarity with it, I dread to think what might happen, which is the political impact of military developments. Security, but at what price? People talk often about the ambiguity, some people even talk about the schizophrenia within the Iraqi officer corps. That on the one hand, professionalism is rewarded and sought for, but on the other hand, you only get promoted by association, by favoritism, by where you stand in relation to the shadow state. And the politicizing effect of that should not be underestimated. Again, the other aspect which has a curious and sinister echo in the previous history of Iraq is that if you use the armed forces for internal policing, it always politicizes them in one form or another. It politicizes them both because many of those in the armed forces disagree with the objects which they're being used, but also because it tends to treat one part of the population of Iraq as a problem community that deserves or merits or is met by or solved by armed force in one form or other. So it lays the groundwork for a politics of resentment and possibly, therefore, down the road of intervention. And again, anyone concerned about Iraqi democracy must be concerned about what that means for a politicized officer corps. Finally, the third aspect, I think, which comes out of this are the regional consequences of a politics of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, the way in which Iraqi politics is often read through the eyes of regional powers, and reading regional powers and their activities into Iraqi politics. As well, of course, as if you alienate a community, then the danger is that community looks beyond the borders for assistance elsewhere in one form or another, to make up, as it were, the balance deprived from the exclusions within. Porous boundaries, in other words, not simply in a physical term, but in an imaginative sense, the effect on the national imaginary. And behind that lies the question, which of course has been a troubling question in Iraqi politics for decades, the suspicion that someone is working for someone else. Who is working for whom? And that can both embitter relations within Iraq, but of course with Iraq's regions as well. So the greatest challenge, to sum up, I would say, is precisely to redress the balance between the public state and the shadow state. And in a sense, parliamentary elections, a strengthening of parliament allows one to do this. And Iraq, of course, is not unique in this regard either. All countries have some element of the shadow state and the public state. And the question is, where does the balance lie? And historically, in my own country, it was a 300-year struggle to make sure that the public state had the edge over the shadow state, the networks of association. But the shadow state doesn't go away. Why is it that something like 40% of parliamentary inquiries in Great Britain are about the abuse of power? about the abuse of public funds, precisely because you cannot trust people once you give them power, which of course is a fitting statement of John Locke's on which to end.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tripp. And last, we have Kirk Sowell.
Thank you, Christine. I also greatly appreciate UIS inviting me here. As I was reading through the biographies in the guide, I noticed a couple of things I would just like to note. One is that I'm way out of my league here. Just looking at some of the other names and the backgrounds, including Professor Tripp, whose book, History, I read, many years ago. It was one of the first I read on Iraq. I'm a bit out of my class, so I'll do what I can to make a contribution. The second thing is that I apparently forgot to give them my Twitter account, because almost everyone else has their Twitter account. You can Google my name and the name of my company as it is in the bios, and it'll come up. And if you like what I say, you can follow me. If you don't, you can troll me or abuse me online, or whatever you want to do. Okay, so I have been asked to talk about the election coalition blocks and party alignments as they relate to Iraq's challenges in the future. As there are 41 coalition blocks registered for what we expect to be elections in April, and 142 parties, I'm obviously not going to be able to talk about most of them. What I've decided to do in order to make the best use of my 10 minutes is to organize this brief discussion around to talk about 3 dynamics and really about 9 blocks. And I will apologize ahead of time to the Kurds. You are going to be short-shifted here. I've decided to focus on the Arabs, mainly the Shia Islamist blocks, and then also the Sunnis, and some of the swing votes between the two. But this does not mean to imply that the Kurds will not be important. This is simply what I have chosen to talk about with my 10 minutes. So, 3 dynamics, 9 important blocks to talk about. The first dynamic is the relationship and the competition between Maliki's State of Law Coalition, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's State of Law Coalition, and his traditional rivals. And by this I mean the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq and the Soderist, in quotes now, Ahrar bloc, put that in finger quotes because of Muqtada Sadr's recent declaration, so I'll come back to that a little bit. But the dynamic here is essentially that these other two traditional rivals are just absolutely determined, I believe, to deny the Prime Minister a third term. This is not the case for every single one of his rivals or his nominal opponents. But I think that Iski, when Bakr Zubaydi, gave that press conference a couple months ago, I think he was sincere about that. I think this Sadr was sincere about that. So the question in terms of the first dynamic is, how well does Maliki do, how well does the state of law do in relationship to these other traditional opponents? In 2010, he got about half the seats from the areas that elect the Shia areas. In last year's provincial elections, he got about a third. So there was a rather sharp reduction. The Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, or ISKI, did a lot better because of organization, and the Sadrists, for a variety of reasons, fell down. If Maliki gets around that 50% again, he's going to be very hard to stop, because the second dynamic I'll talk about in a moment is there's some swing blocks. There's a bandwagon effect. On the other hand, if he gets closer to the third, in other words, if he only does about as well as he did in last year's provincial elections, he may have some problems, because I think that his traditional rivals, and as well as some certain Kurdish parties, will be really determined to block him from a third term if they can do so. And then I'll come back a little bit in a moment about the subcomponents of these major blocks, because that is important, but I'll just hit the dynamics first. So the second dynamic is the swing blocks. I'll come back in a moment. There's 4 that I've identified that I think they're too small to ever have a chance of actually taking over, but there's these 4 blocks that I think will get some seats and will be able to play some role. If Maliki doesn't win a clear mandate, they may be able to either swing it to him, or if he doesn't do well, keep him from being reelected. And then the third dynamic is how things go within the Sunni community, and I don't mean here the mixed blocks with Shia and Sunni, but specifically the Mutahidun, now referred to as Mutahidun al-Islah, or Mutahidun for Reform, led by Speaker Osama Nujafi, and the Arab Coalition, appropriately named, I think, led by Deputy Prime Minister Saleh Mutlaq. The basic division there is between those who believe in a strong centralized state and a hard line in dealing with the Kurds on Kurdish-related issues. That's represented by Mutlaq, and obviously the current policy in Baghdad. And then there are those associated with Najafi who are more aligned with the Kurdish bloc and favor regionalization, formation of new regions, and so on, and are also a bit more Islamist, whereas Mutlaq's people are more secular. Okay, so those are the basic three dynamics, and I think in terms of how these interact is that if Mutlaq does relatively well and his allies, that's clearly good for Maliki. If he gets completely wiped out, and I'm confident that Mutahidun will get a plurality, they'll have the most Sunni seats. Mutlaq doesn't need to get a majority or a plurality. He just needs to do well enough to be able to coalition. But if he gets completely wiped out, that's bad news for Maliki. Okay, so a few things about details. I'm going to come back and talk about these first three blocks again. Maliki's Itilaf Dawlat Qanun, the State of Law Coalition. It has four major parties in it. That's Maliki's Dawa Party, Khadir Khuzai's Dawa Party, Iraq Organization, Deputy Prime Minister for Energy Affairs, Hussein Shahristani's Independence Coalition, and then also the Badr Organization. This is Transportation Minister Hadil Amari's organization. Since last April, they've lost a couple. So Ibrahim Jafari was with Maliki last year. He's not now. Also, the Ayatollah Muhammad Yaqubi's Fadila Party was with Maliki last year, not this year. One general point I'd like to draw about the State of Law Coalition is that when it was formed back in 2009, originally for the provincial elections, then again in 2010 when Maliki refused to join the Iran-backed, somewhat, let's be honest about this, the Iran-backed Iraqi National Alliance. I'm sorry, I almost said Iranian National Alliance. Iraqi National Alliance. Iran wanted Maliki to merge with the other Shia blocs and have just one Shia bloc. He refused. So I think honestly and accurately, Maliki's bloc at that point could have been said to be a nationalist coalition. At this time, though, the subcomponents have moved. They're more Iraq aligned at this point. So, Badr, the Dawa Party, Iraq Organization are very, very much in that line. And then obviously Fadila is an Islamist nationalist movement, and they're out of it. As far as ISKI is concerned, ISKI's coalition, it's called, the formal name is Ittilaf al-Muwatan, the coalition of the citizen. It's about the same as it was last April. The main addition is Ali Dabag's group. They've joined them this time. The Sadrists, this is a big issue. Also, there's a question of whether you can call them the Sadrists now. I would still call them, following the Sadr line. They've recently made some changes to their leadership. They've removed their controversial parliamentary leader, Bahar al-Araji, replaced him with Mashaq al-Naji. And they've got a new board that includes the governors of Baghdad and Maysan. So they're looking to clean up their image in somewhat. And again, it's unclear exactly what ramifications will take place because of Sadr's much disputed statements and isolation from the political process to the extent that it's real. Now, in terms of these, what I'm calling swing coalitions, they're not all completely swing. They lean one way or the other. But there's four that I'd like to talk about just a little bit. One is a group called the National Fidelity Coalition. This is headed by Wael Abdul Latif of Basra, former judge, former governor. He's a big commentator on TV, Al-Fayha and other things. He's always very critical of Maliki. His coalition also includes Izzat Shabander, formerly of Iraqiyya and more recently formerly of the State of Law Coalition. Shabander and Maliki obviously broke badly. So if Maliki doesn't seal it, this is a coalition, this National Fidelity Coalition, that will probably move away from him, might swing things away from him. The second of these four sort of mid-sized groups is the Iraqi Fidelity Coalition. And this the main figures here are Sami al-Askari, Najaf Governor Adnan al-Zurfi, and then the new mayor of Baghdad, Naim Abu al-Qabi. This is a quasi-SLC entity. Askari is still associating with the SLC at the federal level. Zurfi is a former on and again, off again ally of Maliki. They've had their problems, but they're not that far apart. Abub is a former excommunicated Sadrist who aligned with Maliki last year and was appointed by Maliki to be mayor in November. So this is a group that if Maliki gets close enough, I think that they'll align with him. There's something called the Iraq Coalition, which includes Ali Sadri of Anbar, Qurayb al-Jaburi of Salahuddin, and Muhammad Masawi of Karbala. This is the Amal al-Rafidain group. All three of these at some point or another have been allied with Maliki. So again, if there will be a bandwagon effect if Maliki does reasonably well. And then the fourth of these sort of mid-level groups is what's Ayad Alawi's group. The label they're going under now is the Ittilaf al-Wataniya, or the Nationalist Coalition. Alawi in last year's elections got hardly any seats in the Shia areas. He got a small number of seats, but they were almost all from Sunni votes. And if you're a voter who watches Shia television, or the state-owned but Maliki-controlled Iraqi, Qanat Iraqiyya, if you watch that or you watch any of the other Shia television channels, Alawi has almost no presence. I don't expect him to be a significant factor, but he would definitely be, given his hostility with Maliki, will be a negative factor for Maliki if he does get some seats. And then finally, a few notes, if I think I have just a couple of minutes left, about the Sunnis. There's these two main blocks that I've identified. This has significant ramifications because whereas with the Shia, many of the differences are personalities. There's not, regardless of what they say, there's not a lot of policy difference. But with Mutlaq and Nujayfi, there's a very clear policy difference. Just a couple of things about their coalitions that are notable. Nujayfi, since last April, has taken on Jamal al-Karbuli's Al-Hal. This is important because Karbuli was with Mutlaq and he won 3 of the 4 seats that Mutlaq won last June in Anbar. But Karbuli, after breaking with Maliki, is now on Nujayfi's side. And then also, in Salahuddin, where they may have problems because the head of their list there, Amar Yusuf Hamoud, is involved in a long-standing controversy where he's accused of being involved in terrorist attacks a couple of years ago. And then regarding Mutlaq, just a couple of things. One is that he has added to his coalition Ahmed Abdullah Ajburi. This is the governor of Salahuddin, his Iraqi Masses coalition. Governor Jaburi is someone who's worked with Maliki and is something of a centralist. The other individual I wanted to mention is Mishana Jaburi, rather infamous individual. He recently, some of you may know, he was excluded by IHEC, frankly because he's a Saddamist. But then very recently, just in the last couple of days, the judiciary, which is not independent, has vindicated him and returned him. So there's a very clear, and I would note that Jaburi is known for being very anti-Kurdish, very secularist. He was backing the insurgency in Syria just a few years ago, and it says a lot, I think, about the direction that Maliki wants to go in, that he's decided to work with someone like this that so many Shia really hate. So it's just a final point then. What I will say is that we need to look at how well Maliki does. If he doesn't do well, if he does do well, then I think he will be reelected. But even then, we've not seen real development of institutions. This is something Professor Tripp noted. And when you have the judiciary headed by Midhat Mahmoud, who's a Maliki ally, vindicating people like Mishana Jaburi, this tells you something about the reliability of judicial decisions. On the other hand, if he doesn't do well, then the question will be, who will these other swing blocks coalesce around? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. For this panel, we are taking Twitter questions. And so I encourage the audience, if you do have questions for our panelists, it will have to be at another time because I've been instructed to only take Twitter questions for this panel. In the interest of time, I'm sure you all can understand. Just one question, Kirk. You just gave a lot of details about the Iraqi politics, so informative. Can you just very quickly, can these parties and coalitions tell us anything about the trajectory of Iraqi politics? I mean, is it more divisive? I mean, do you see any sort of political reconciliation, any sort of possibilities for that? Or are we is a still stalemate divisive?
I would say the answer is no. I mean, obviously, the answer is no. I mean, this is breaks down in a very divisive way. Again, among the Shia, I think that there are relatively limited actual political policy differences. This is about a struggle for power, much more than anything. And yes, it's true that there are some of these. I mean, the exception would be if you see some of these middling forces getting a fair number of seats. Well, that would be a positive sign, because some of these have a mixture of Sunni and Shia parties in them. And whether with Abdul Latif, whether you agree with his Basra regionalism or not, he's the kind of guy. He's not a divisive figure, really. You can agree or disagree with him or not. So that could be a positive. But then have to see what comes out. I mean, right now, Maliki has been pretty successful since he controls state television in framing everything that's happening in Anbar as sort of his war on terrorism. And then on the Sunni side, it's basically guaranteed, no matter whether Nujafi or Mutlaq does well, I'd say it's guaranteed to be divisive. Because I think Nujafi, they'll get a majority or plurality of the Sunni vote no matter what. But if they get a crushing majority, then the division will be between whoever the Shia elect and then Sunni Nujafi. Mm-hmm. If on the and of course Nujafi is closer to the Kurds, so theoretically you could imagine less division between Baghdad and Erbil if Nujafi does really well, and let's say Maliki loses and someone else who has a different policy orientation takes his place. On the other hand, if Mutlaq does well, you're still going to have divisiveness, but it's a different kind of divisiveness because Mutlaq's line is a very hard line with regard to the KRG. Mm-hmm. So I would say I'm not real optimistic about that.
Thank you. And a couple questions from our audience on Twitter. One for you, Dr. Tripp. What would the repercussions of a increased autonomy or a separate Kurdish state be for Iraq?
I think the obvious question is that if the Kurdish region becomes an independent state, then it will have a catastrophic effect on Iraq. I mean, Kurdistan region is a part of Iraq, and therefore the notion of a separation is problematic in two ways. One, it's a symptom that something has fundamentally broken down with the structure of the Iraqi state. So it's not just what its consequences would be, but actually what it is the consequence of. And there, I think it's very, very problematic because there is a sense in which the separation will come at the end of a period of conflict and tension. What it leads to, of course, is the other possibility that politics in Iraq therefore becomes purely dominated by the kind of divisiveness that Kirk was talking about. The notion that the balancing factor, which the Kurdish parties have to some extent played within a sectarian game, might be eliminated. And that, again, in the current atmosphere in the Middle East, might be really problematic for the future of Iraqi politics.
Thank you. This will be the last question, and I'm just going in order that they were received, so I apologize if I did not reach your question. One Twitter feed was wondering if you all could comment on Hajim Hussein and Fala Al-Fayed and their kind of debate and comments earlier, if you all had any sort of thoughts about their interaction and comments.
Well,
yeah, open to all of you.
Okay, I'm being volunteered. Okay, so an example, Falah Fayyad, this is who you mean. Maliki recently created a new military unit under Jihaz al-Aman al-Watani, the national security apparatus. I mean, they keep changing the name of it. But this is a very good example. This is on YouTube. If you know Arabic, you can watch this. Fayyad was obviously there because he heads this institution. And they have a poet there who's praising Maliki, and they introduce Maliki as father to his children and all of this kind of stuff. And it's actually a rare exception to the case that you often don't see the formation of the shadow state. Here was a military unit under an entity. There's no law, there's no legal basis for it. the prime minister is being called, the father of the nation and all of this kind of stuff, and praise to the sky. And there's no indication, what law governs, how they operate or anything. And so, I mean, the thing is, this is just sort of reinforces my point. I mean, there is no rule of law. There is no institutions. The way the judiciary has been run under Midhat Mahmoud, there's absolutely no reliability to the judicial decisions, in my opinion. And so I would say, I mean, it's not a state of institutions and rules. It's a state of power struggle. And it's just a question of who can use these institutions, like the state television channel, for example, Maliki uses, who can use these institutions to get themselves into power, and then once you're in power, use the institutions and apparatuses to maintain power and so on.
Thank you. In the interest of time and moving forward, I think we're going to wrap up the Iraq panel. I really thank you all. I think our panelists have presented a lot of challenges, violence, shadow state, elections and divisive coalitions that remain. But I think conversations like this also present opportunities for all of us to think about these things. So I appreciate and I encourage you all to please ask our panelists questions, possibly during coffee breaks and whatnot, if you do have them. So thank you all very much, and thank you all.